I really enjoy making documentaries. They're educational, they're adventurous, and they're usually less expensive to produce than other types of film and video. Documentaries are about real people and real events. So you usually don't need actors, sets, costumes, and a lot of the other stuff that tend to make movie making so expensive and difficult. Now, the big exception to this comes as soon as you decide to include some kind of reenactments in a documentary.
I think we have what we need, but now I'm going to just shoot a bunch of close-ups in case we need some cutaway shots.
As soon as you decide to do that, you enter the strange and stressful world of the Hollywood-type production. I experienced this recently when a client of mine asked me to include just a few small reenactments in a history documentary I was producing. And that's when we entered what I call the low-budget time machine. The project was a history of the Port of Seattle. We plan to use a Ken Burns kind of style with lots of old photos and interviews with historians. But my client said she loves the reenactments she sees on like the History Channel. And couldn't we have a few of those? I said, wow, that's probably going to be way too expensive for our budget. But I would see what I could do to include a few very small reenactments using just props and people's hands and so on. That was the idea we started with. But it grew. Some things were easy to reenact just using small props. For example, for a section about a law that was passed by the Washington State Legislature, I went to a trophy store and I bought this gavel and I banged it on my desk and then superimposed it on an old map of the harbor. And that was sufficient to symbolize the event. Next, I started looking for bigger things like boats and trains that I could use to evoke the past without having to resort to costumed actors. Every summer in Seattle there's a wooden boat festival, so I took my camera down there and got shots of sailing ships that came in very handy. There's also an old steamboat that takes wedding parties out on weekends. So I went for a ride on a friend's boat and took along a student of mine from a school where I teach video production. And we got lots of shots of the steamboat way out on Lake Washington where there was nothing modern in the background. So it really looks like the boat is steaming right out of the past. Railroads played a really big part in the port's history, and there were lots of old photos and sound effects I could use, but I wanted more action. I remembered seeing a working steam train in a little town down near Mount Rainier. Problem was, I don't have a car, I don't drive, and there was no bus I could take to get there. So I suggested to some of my students that we go on a little field trip, and I made sure one of them had a car. I paid for all the expenses, and the four of us had a great time for 2 days down there chasing this old steam train around through the woods and the fields.
We're setting up an ambush for a train. This is our weapon, so you got your own weapon, just point it to the train, shoot it.
So they're at the private crossing right now, and like I said, they'll come in tender first, and we'll go right back there and we'll hook up.
When we first arrived at the train depot, we had a bit of a shock. We found out that on half of its trips, the locomotive drives backwards due to some logistical situation. Shots of these trips were going to be useless because it just looked silly. But then we realized that if we were to ride on the train and shoot out of the front of the first car, we could get close-up shots of the locomotive facing right at us.
We're gonna have to run this footage in reverse to make it look like we're going forward. But then what I'm worried about is then the smoke and the steam are gonna be going in, like the train is sucking them in. But I don't know, it might work.
By running the footage backwards, I was able to get a pretty dramatic effect that would have been almost impossible if the locomotive hadn't been turned around backward. So, what seemed like a problem at first turned out to be a blessing in disguise.
All forward. All forward.
Another reenactment idea started out simple but ended up being pretty elaborate. I remembered reading how the early settlers in Seattle discovered how deep the harbor was when they lowered a horseshoe into the water on the end of a clothesline. And now I thought, this is going to be simple to reenact. All I need is a close-up of a horseshoe and maybe someone's hands lowering it into the water. But then I found out about this local group called Somewhere in Time that volunteers to do history events and film shoots and so on. And that's when the floodgates opened. I ended up spending almost 2 months planning a pretty big reenactment involving 5 actors, full costumes, a 600-pound canoe, a chase boat, and lots of rusty old horseshoes, just in case we lost a few on the bottom. We shot this reenactment pretty close to where the actual event would have occurred, right off of a waterfront park in downtown Seattle. Now, 150 years ago, there was a thick forest here. So what I did is I went to another park where there are still some old-growth Douglas fir trees, got shots looking through these trees out on the water, and then through the magic of digital video editing, I was able to combine the 2 shots, and all of a sudden we've got a forest growing in downtown Seattle again. For the ending of this canoe scene, I realized that I could take advantage of the straight line of the horizon to put anything I wanted in the background. I decided to try to recreate Seattle Harbor as it would have looked in 1852. I got on my bike, rode around the area for a weekend, getting shots of marshland, trees blowing in the wind, birds flying through the sky, and combined them into this pretty elaborate collage that I was able to put in the background of the canoe scene. And then for the finale, I was able to dissolve from the primordial forest to a view of the port today, which was a really cool effect. Another key moment in the history of the port was in September of 1911, when voters in Seattle went to the polls and approved a bond measure that actually created the port. There was almost nothing visual that we could use to illustrate this, so we decided to do a little reenactment. From a local museum, I got a description of a voting box from the period, and then I went out and bought this fake antique wooden box, and I cut a slit in the top of it. For a location, a lady from Somewhere in Time suggested an office building in downtown Seattle. It was actually built in the 1920s, but it hadn't been renovated, so it really looked like it could have been a municipal building from 1911. I was awake most of the night listening to the rain going, yes, rain now, get it out of your system, keep raining, and then stop, right in time. Doors open. Beautiful. All right, so let's just put everything in the lobby first. We shot this scene early on a Sunday morning, and when we arrived on the set, we had a little surprise waiting for us. It was much darker in the lobby than it had been in my test shots because the lights were out. I asked the guard to turn them on, and he said he couldn't. They were on a timer that automatically shuts them off on the weekends, and he couldn't turn them back on. So while the actors were upstairs getting dressed, I was downstairs in the lobby with my students, freaking out, trying to light this big dark lobby with the few little lights that we had. I finally realized that we didn't have enough time or equipment to do that, so luckily my camera had great low light capabilities, and we were able to shoot with just the light streaming into the lobby from other areas, and it looked fun. In the end, all of this effort resulted in probably just a couple of minutes of screen time. And there were certainly times during the project when I felt like I must be nuts to be devoting so much time and effort to these reenactments when I could get away with just using some still photos if I wanted. But in the end, I think it was all worth it. The reenactments really bring some magic and fun to the documentary, and I was very gratified when a viewer commented that watching it, he felt like he was taking a ride in a time machine. To be able to step into the past and imagine, even just for a moment, what it might have been like to live in another era or to be present at an historic event, that's a very exciting feeling to me, and one that I enjoy sharing with other people.